They whispered about him long before anyone dared to say his name aloud. In the quiet corners of taverns, in the hushed voices of women drawing water from the well, in the breathless murmurs of children who swore they had seen him at night, there was talk of a boy who should not exist, Samuel Price. His story began not with a shout, but with a silence, one that stretched far too long, too heavy for comfort, and seemed to echo even after he'd left the room. No one could quite place the moment when the rumors turned into something darker. At first, it was only small things, details dismissed as coincidence. A candle that sputtered out as the boy entered the room. A door that creaked open without a hand to push it. Animals, the kind that normally skittered away from strangers, holding their gaze steady on him, ears flat, eyes wide, as though they recognized something people did not. But in a town where every life was ordered by faith, superstition, and the laws of the land, these little disturbances gathered like dry leaves waiting for a spark. And the spark came quickly. One evening, in the still air of late summer, a group of boys dared each other to creep up to the Price farmhouse after sunset. They were young, but even the young could sense that something about Samuel wasn't right. They crept through the fields, mud on their shoes, whispering nervous laughter to cover their fear. And then they saw it. Through the window, a glow, not fire, not candle, not lamp, pulsing in faint rhythm around Samuel as he sat in silence at the kitchen table. It shimmered like the air above a road in the heat, warping everything around him. The boys froze, their breath catching in their throats. One swore Samuel's eyes turned directly to them, though the boy inside never moved his head, never shifted in his chair. They ran back screaming into the dark, and not one of them spoke of it for weeks, but word spread. It always did. The blacksmith muttered that his hammer had leapt from his hand when Samuel passed by. A farmer claimed his plough stopped mid-furrow until the boy was gone. A mother told of her infant's sudden shrieks, piercing, desperate cries whenever Samuel neared, as if the child could sense something too terrible to name. These accounts were carried on the wind, carried with fear, until the whole town began to feel as though they lived under the shadow of a curse. And yet, the boy himself never spoke of it. Samuel Price remained quiet, watchful, as though he carried a secret too vast to share. His presence unsettled even in stillness. Neighbors described his silence as too large, as if it pressed against the room, swallowing every other sound. Some swore that when he looked at you, it felt less like being seen and more like being studied, measured against something you couldn't comprehend. It was easier perhaps to believe he was unnatural than to admit they were afraid of a child. The preacher warned his flock of temptations and trickery, weaving sermons around shadows and devils that walked in human skin. The men of reason, the schoolteacher, the town doctor, rolled their eyes at such talk, yet even they kept their distance. You didn't need belief when fear was enough. And still, Samuel grew. The strange incidents became harder to ignore. A thunderclap on a cloudless day, the ground trembling beneath bare feet, windows rattling though no wind stirred. Each event seemed to tie itself to him, invisible threads pulling the town tighter and tighter into unease. By now, every whispered prayer, every nervous glance carried his name. Samuel Price, the boy who should not be. It was not just fear, it was confusion, the kind that gnaws at the mind. How could a boy, no more than a child, unmake the world around him in ways no one could explain? In an accident, when men clung fiercely to what they could touch and measure, Samuel was something else entirely, a reminder that the universe was larger, stranger, and darker than they wanted to admit. And yet, in the heart of this growing storm, Samuel himself remained still, like the eye of a hurricane. He did not run, did not boast, did not explain. He simply existed, and that was enough to shake the town to its core. No one could have known then how deep the story would cut, how many lives it would claim, or how history itself would be haunted by the boy in the shadows. But the whispers had already taken root, and soon they would grow into screams. Because in 1852, in a world straddling the line between superstition and science, the name Samuel Price would come to represent the one thing people feared most: the impossible. And as the years passed, every man, woman, and child who crossed his path would come to ask the same chilling question, not what he was, but whether he was ever meant to be at all. In 1852, America was a land caught between two worlds. On one side, the rise of science promised to unravel the mysteries of nature. Telegraph lines stitched across the nation like veins of lightning, trains thundered over new iron tracks, and newspapers brimmed with stories of invention, progress, and reason. On the other side lay the older world, one rooted in superstition, in faith, in the unshakable belief that heaven and hell were never far from human lives. In the countryside, where towns like Mill Creek stood half forgotten by the rush of modernity, it was this older world that held dominion. And in that world, the presence of Samuel Price was not just unusual, it was unholy. Mill Creek was the kind of town where every Sunday pew was filled, where the toll of the church bell measured out the rhythm of life, where gossip traveled faster than the stagecoach that stopped twice a month. Its people were farmers, blacksmiths, millers, hard lives, honest hands, men and women who believed in the certainty of what they could plow, forge, or trade. But faith filled the gaps where certainty ended. A sick cow was not simply sick, it might be cursed. A stillborn child was not merely tragedy, it was a test from God. These beliefs lingered in every kitchen and field, shaping lives as surely as the rising sun. So when Samuel entered their world, when the whispers of his strangeness began to circulate, they did not see a child. They saw an omen. The very air of Mill Creek seemed to shift. Where once laughter might have carried down its dirt roads, silence crept in its place. People walked faster, heads lowered, eyes wary, as though something unseen watched from every corner. Mothers tightened their grip on their children's hands whenever Samuel passed, and fathers offered curt nods instead of greetings, careful not to linger. It wasn't hatred, it was something colder. It was fear in its purest form, the kind that makes a town hold its breath. And still Samuel did not speak of what surrounded him. He did not defend himself, nor did he invite company. He was a shadow among them, his silence louder than words, his presence a weight they could not shake. What unsettled the townsfolk most was not the things that happened around him, but the way he carried them, calm, untouched, as if the chaos bent itself to his will. To those bound by superstition, this was sorcery. To those leaning toward science, it was something just as terrifying, the unknown. The preacher, Reverend Alden, seized upon the unease like a wolf scenting blood. From his pulpit, he thundered about the dangers of false idols, of demons that wore the faces of children, of the eternal war between God's order and the devil's mockery. Though he never named Samuel directly, no one needed him to. The congregation sat rigid in their pews, glancing toward the Price family as though the words were arrows meant to pierce their hearts. Each sermon deepened the divide between Samuel and the rest of Mill Creek, until even neighbors who had once brought bread to the Price doorstep now crossed the street instead. But not everyone surrendered fully to superstition. The town doctor, Elias Granger, prided himself on reason, on the tools and books that made him something more than a simple country physician. To him, Samuel was no devil's child. He was something different, yes, but something that should be studied, understood. Yet even Granger could not deny the unease that crept over him when Samuel's eyes lingered too long, when silence filled the room like fog. He wrote in his notes that the boy unsettled him, not because of what he did, but because of what he seemed to carry, an air that reminded one, absurdly, of the vastness of space. And if a man of science could admit such dread, what hope did the common folk have? Fear does strange things to a community. It isolates, it distorts, it turns every shadow into a threat. Soon, accidents that had nothing to do with Samuel were laid at his feet. A horse broke its leg in a ditch. Someone swore Samuel had passed by that morning. A storm tore through the valley. Neighbors muttered that he had been seen staring at the sky the day before. Each coincidence wove itself into a larger pattern, one painted not with facts but with fear, until no one could remember where the truth ended and the whispers began. The Price family felt the change most of all. Once welcomed, they became pariahs. Invitations dried up. Friendly visits stopped. At the general store, conversations cut short as soon as they entered. The prices had done nothing, yet they were treated as though they carried a sickness no cure could touch. For them, home became a fortress. The shutters stayed closed more often, the gate left locked. The laughter of community had turned into the low hum of suspicion, and they bore it in silence. Yet silence only deepened the mystery. Had the Prices defended their son, spoken openly, perhaps it would have calmed the rising tide. Instead, their quiet resolve seemed to confirm the townsfolk's worst suspicions that the family was hiding something unspeakable, something too dangerous to let out into the world. By autumn, Mill Creek was a town changed. Where once it had been filled with ordinary worries, crop yields, weather, the occasional quarrel, now its heartbeat was measured in glances toward the boy who should not be. Fear had frozen the town in place. It was no longer a place where progress or reason mattered. It was a place waiting for the next strange event, the next impossible moment, the next proof that Samuel Price was not one of them. And in that waiting, a deeper truth began to grow, unspoken, but heavy in every mind. Whatever Samuel was, he was not simply a child. Because in Mill Creek, children were born, grew, worked, and died like their parents before them. They fit neatly into the rhythm of life. Samuel did not. He stood apart, a discordant note in a hymn that demanded harmony. And the longer he remained, the more certain the townsfolk became that he was not merely disturbing their lives, he was unraveling the very order of their world. What no one yet realized was that Samuel's story had only begun to unfold. The fear that froze Mill Creek was only the surface, a trembling shadow of something much greater. For when the tale of Samuel Price reached its next chapter, the story of his birth, every whisper, every sermon, every fearful glance would prove not to have been enough. Because what happened on the night Samuel entered this world was darker than any of them had dared imagine. Every haunting begins with a beginning, and Samuel's was written in blood and silence. It was the spring of 1852 when the skies above Mill Creek seemed to shift. Farmers swore the rains came too early, pounding their fields until the soil was more mud than earth. Livestock grew restless, lowing deep into the Niki, as though calling out warnings no one could understand. Even the air felt heavy, pressing against the lungs, and yet, amidst the unease of that season, the Price family prepared for joy, the birth of their first child. Rebecca Price was a quiet woman, steadfast and kind, with eyes that shone despite the hardships of frontier life. Her husband, Thomas, was proud and hard-working, a man whose hands bore the calluses of the land, but whose heart beat with the hope of a future better than his own childhood. For months they spoke of the child as though he were already there, imagining his voice, his steps, the simple laughter that would fill their modest farmhouse. They could not know that what was coming was no ordinary child. The night of Samuel's birth arrived with a storm unlike any Mill Creek had ever seen. The winds howled through the valley, bending trees as though they were reeds. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged veins, striking so close that the earth trembled. Midwives hurried through sheets of rain to reach the Price home, clutching their cloaks tight around them, muttering prayers under their breath. To some, it felt less like a storm and more like a warning. Inside the farmhouse, candles flickered against the walls as Rebecca labored. The midwives worked swiftly, their hands practiced, but something was wrong. The storm outside seemed to seep into the room itself, the air charged, the walls rattling with each roll of thunder. And then, the silence. When Samuel emerged into the world, he did not cry. A newborn's cry is a promise of life, a sign that the lungs have filled, that breath has been claimed from the air. But Samuel lay silent in the midwife's arms, his skin pale, his chest rising and falling in eerie calm. Rebecca, exhausted and fearful, reached out for her son, but even in her arms he made no sound. The midwives exchanged worried glances, whispering that perhaps he had no voice, that perhaps he was already gone. But then his eyes opened. They were not the cloudy, unfocused eyes of a newborn. They were sharp, unblinking, a blue so deep they seemed to swallow the light around them. The midwife who held him swore later that it felt less like looking into the eyes of a child and more like being seen by something older than time. The room fell still, as though the storm itself was holding its breath. At that exact moment, the wind outside died. The thunder stopped mid-roll. The rain ceased as though a hand had drawn a curtain across the sky. From chaos to silence in the span of a heartbeat, the midwives crossed themselves, muttering prayers they barely remembered, and one quietly suggested the child was born under a curse. Thomas Price, fierce in his love, silenced them with a glare. He would not allow fear to mark his son's first moments of life, but even he could not deny the strangeness. As the days turned into weeks, the signs only multiplied. Samuel did not cry, not even in hunger or pain. His silence was unnatural, heavy, pressing against the nerves of anyone near him. He would stare for hours, his gaze fixed on corners of the room where no one else saw anything. Neighbors who came to visit out of courtesy left unsettled, some claiming they felt chills in their bones when the infant's eyes met theirs. One visitor, a farmer's wife, swore she saw objects shift on their own when Samuel was in the room. A candlestick sliding slightly across the table, a chair creaking without touch. She left in haste and never returned. Even Rebecca, devoted as she was, admitted in her private journal that she sometimes felt as though her son was not hers at all. "It is as though," she wrote, "he belongs not to me, nor to Thomas, nor to this world. He watches me as though I am the child, and he the keeper." Her words were never meant to leave the farmhouse, but in later years they would become part of the growing legend, proof to those who doubted. The town, of course, noticed. It was impossible not to. The silence of a child carries as loudly as screams when it defies expectation. By the time Samuel was 3 months old, people no longer asked why. They never heard him cry. They asked only what it meant. Superstition ran deep in Mill Creek, and omens were carved into daily life like scripture. A child born during a storm was already suspect. A child who never cried. Unheard of. A child with eyes that seemed to burn with unnatural focus. Surely a sign that he was marked. The whispers began, soft at first, then louder. Some said he was a changeling, swapped by spirits in the night. Others said he was a test, sent by God or the devil to measure the town's faith. The Prices tried to shield him, but they could not stop the stories. They spread faster than the truth, filling every corner of Mill Creek, until Samuel became less a boy than a question. What was he? Why was he here? And how long until something worse followed him? The first years of Samuel's life offered no answers, only more unease. His silence remained. His eyes grew sharper, and every so often, when the wind stilled or the air grew charged without warning, people glanced toward the Price farmhouse with the same thought. Somehow, it was all tied to him. They had no idea how right they were. For Samuel's birth had not been the beginning of strangeness in Mill Creek. It had been the opening of a door, one that, once unlocked, would never close again, and soon the world would witness things no child should ever possess. By the time Samuel turned 5, the whispers had grown louder than the bells of Mill Creek's church. His silence was no longer the strangest thing about him. What unsettled the town most were the things that happened when he was near, the small fractures in the natural order, the moments that left even the most stubborn minds trembling. It began with objects. At first his parents dismissed it as tricks of the eye, a cup sliding an inch across the table, a wooden spoon rolling toward him though no hand touched it, but the more it happened, the harder it became to deny. One morning, Rebecca entered the kitchen to find her son staring at a loaf of bread, his tiny brow furrowed in concentration. Before her eyes, the knife beside it lifted just a breath off the surface and clattered back down. She gasped, covering her mouth, but Samuel only looked at her with those deep, piercing eyes, as if to ask why she was surprised. The family swore never to speak of such things, but secrets have a way of escaping. A visiting cousin witnessed a chair drag itself across the room when Samuel sat alone. A neighbor delivering eggs swore the boy had been standing at the window watching when the latch lifted on its own and the door swung wide. Each story joined the growing body of whispers that followed Samuel wherever he went. But what made the tales impossible to ignore was not just the moving of objects. It was Samuel himself. He never seemed to feel pain. Once, while helping his father chop wood, the axe slipped and struck across his arm. Rebecca screamed, but Samuel only looked down at the cut, blood welling bright against pale skin, his expression calm, unshaken. He neither cried nor flinched. Days later, when Thomas checked the wound, it had already sealed without so much as a scar. Word of this traveled quickly, and soon people were whispering that he could not be harmed, that his very flesh rejected the laws of man and nature. Then came his memory. It began with names. Samuel remembered every face, every voice, every word spoken to him since infancy. He could repeat a sentence back to his mother, word for word, even years after she had said it. At first, Thomas called it a blessing, proof his boy was clever beyond his years. But as Samuel grew older, it became eerie. He quoted back conversations neighbors didn't even remember having. He recited whole passages of sermons after a single hearing, every syllable precise. Even Granger, the town physician who still clung to reason, confessed in his journals that Samuel's recall was inhuman, as if he carries the burden of 1,000 minds. Some began to fear that Samuel's silence was not absence, but choice, that he did not speak because he was listening, storing, gathering everything. And perhaps, they whispered, he knew more than anyone should. Animals, too, seemed to sense it. Dogs snarled and barked in his presence, though they shrank back instead of attacking. Horses grew skittish if he approached, stamping and pulling at their reins until he stepped away. Birds often fell silent when he walked beneath their trees, as though the air itself warned them. Only cats appeared drawn to him, gathering on the Price farmhouse porch in unsettling numbers, their glowing eyes following him wherever he went. Some townsfolk muttered that cats were creatures of the devil, and that their strange devotion was proof of Samuel's unholy nature. The more the town saw, the more its fear hardened. Farmers crossed themselves when Samuel passed. Children dared each other to touch the fence of the Price property, fleeing in shrieks if the wind so much as rustled a branch. Even the preacher, once content to thunder vague warnings, began to name him directly in sermons. "Beware false wonders," Reverend Alden roared. "Beware the child of silence, whose hands work not by God's grace, but by the enemy's deceit." But fear could not explain away what people witnessed with their own eyes. There was the day the mill's great wheel froze mid-turn, though the stream rushed on with steady force. Workers shouted, baffled, pulling at the mechanism, until someone spotted Samuel standing quietly on the bank. He watched with calm detachment, and the moment his gaze drifted elsewhere, the wheel groaned back to life. None spoke of it openly, but every man there carried the story back to his family. There was the night a fire broke out in the stables. Flames spread fast, threatening the entire property, and yet when neighbors rushed to help, they found Samuel standing barefoot in the dirt, no fear in his eyes. The flames bent away from him, curling like waves breaking against an unseen wall. By the time they reached the stables, the fire had died on its own, leaving charred wood but no destruction. No water, no intervention, only the silent boy watching with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. And there was the storm. A violent gale swept through Mill Creek, tearing branches from trees, rattling shutters from their hinges. Families huddled in cellars praying for deliverance. Yet the Price farmhouse stood untouched. Neighbors claimed they saw the storm split as it approached, winds bending in two streams to pass around the house, leaving it and its inhabitants untouched. When dawn came, devastation lay on either side of the property, but not a single shingle had been displaced on the Price's roof. Each incident added weight to the fear pressing down on Mill Creek. These were not coincidences. These were not the ordinary misfortunes and blessings of life. They were phenomena no child should possess, tied again and again to one silent boy. For Samuel, It was not a choice. He did not ask for these things to happen. If anything, he seemed almost indifferent to them, as though they were as natural to him as breathing. Yet his indifference only deepened the terror. For what kind of child does not marvel at miracles? What kind of child accepts the impossible as ordinary? To the townsfolk, there could only be two answers. He was blessed beyond comprehension or cursed beyond salvation. And in a place like Mill Creek, where superstition outweighed science and fear outweighed compassion, blessing was not the conclusion most would reach. By his 10th year, Samuel was not just a boy. He was a symbol, an embodiment of something larger than himself. To some, he was proof of God's wrath. To others, proof that the devil had found a foothold in their midst. And to the few who dared whisper of it, he was evidence that the world itself was stranger than anyone wanted to believe. But one truth was clear: Samuel Price was no longer simply a child of Mill Creek. He was its shadow, its burden, its secret shame, and the more the town tried to deny him, the more impossible his existence became to ignore. It was only a matter of time before the wider world came knocking. Men of science, men of faith, all seeking to answer the question that Mill Creek could not. And when they came, they would discover that Samuel Price was not only a boy science could not explain. He was a mystery that defied both heaven and hell. By the time Samuel reached his 12th year, the whispers of Mill Creek had spread beyond the valley. It is one thing for gossip to stain the air of a small town. It is another for rumors to travel on horseback, carried to the ears of men who believed they held dominion over truth itself. The impossible had a way of attracting both the pious and the proud, and so, in the summer of 1864, strangers began arriving at the Price farmhouse, each with their own vision of what Samuel was, and what he might prove. The first were doctors. Dr. Elias Granger had kept his careful notes on Samuel since the boy's birth, documenting the peculiar silences, the unnatural memory, the impossible recoveries from wounds. At first he had written privately, wary of ridicule, but curiosity is a contagion, and in time he could not resist sharing his findings with colleagues beyond Mill Creek. Soon, physicians from neighboring counties came to see for themselves. They arrived with stethoscopes, notebooks, and instruments gleaming in the sunlight, their boots too polished for farm soil, their eyes bright with ambition. They tested his pulse. It was steady, though sometimes impossibly slow, as though his heart did not obey the rhythms of ordinary flesh. They pricked his skin with needles, noting how quickly the marks vanished. They measured his lungs, his vision, his reflexes, and recorded results that defied expectation. "He is human," one doctor muttered, "yet he is not bound by human frailty." Another whispered, "If we understood him, perhaps we would understand how to master life itself." But Samuel never flinched. He sat in silence while they studied him, watching them with the same calm, unsettling gaze that had driven neighbors to shiver. And though he gave no words, the doctors often left their examinations with hands that trembled slightly, as if the boy had revealed something without speaking. Where science stumbled, the clergy pressed harder. Reverend Alden had long declared Samuel a vessel of darkness, but now ministers from other towns came to witness him themselves. Some brought holy water, sprinkling it across his skin to see if he recoiled. He did not. Some recited scripture, watching his eyes for signs of rage. He only stared, silent as ever. A few, braver than most, demanded he confess if he was touched by the devil. Samuel gave no answer. To the faithful, silence itself was damning. One priest, Father Whitcomb, insisted on bringing Samuel inside the church, believing that if evil resided within him, the sanctity of God's house would force it out. Samuel walked down the aisle, the floorboards creaking beneath his small steps. The congregation held its breath. The boy reached the altar, placed his hand upon the Bible, and the candles in the sanctuary flickered wildly, though no draught stirred the air. Some screamed, others prayed aloud, but Samuel only lowered his gaze, as if weary of the spectacle. Not all men who came were clergy or doctors. Some were seekers, self-proclaimed scholars, men dabbling in the occult, collectors of the strange. They arrived with questions no ordinary child should have been expected to answer. Did he remember past lives? Could he communicate with spirits? Did he know secrets of the stars? To these inquiries, Samuel gave the same gift he gave all others: silence. Yet silence to such men was not emptiness, it was possibility. They left with more questions than they came, speaking of the boy as though he were an artifact, a relic of something beyond comprehension. The Price family endured these visits with quiet desperation. Thomas grew protective, often barring entry to those who demanded too much. Rebecca prayed daily, torn between awe of her son and fear for his soul. Their home became less a sanctuary and more a cage of constant intrusion. Strangers knocked at all hours, demanding to see, to touch, to test. Samuel himself neither resisted nor invited them. He seemed indifferent, as though the opinions of men mattered little in whatever world he carried within. But each visit left its mark on the town. Mill Creek became divided. Some saw the outsider's interest as proof that Samuel was not a curse but a marvel, a sign that their forgotten town had birthed something extraordinary. Others believed the attention was dangerous, that meddling with such a child would bring ruin. The tavern filled nightly with arguments, voices raised in fear and fascination. The town, once united by suspicion, was now fractured by the weight of the boy they could not understand. The more the learned men studied him, the less they agreed. The doctors could not categorize him, the clergy could not exorcise him, the seekers could not define him. Every test, every prayer, every theory ended the same way, in silence, with Samuel's steady eyes staring back at them as if to say, "You will never understand." And yet the one thing they all shared, scientists, priests and dreamers alike, was unease. It was not only what Samuel did that unsettled them, but what he might do. If he could move objects, resist pain, recall every detail of his life, what else lay dormant within him? Was he a child on the edge of some new form of being, or was he a harbinger of something that should never be awakened? By autumn the visits grew fewer. The doctors had gathered their notes, priests had shaken their heads, and the seekers had muttered their theories. None had answers, all had questions, and in their wake, Mill Creek was left not with clarity, but with dread. Because it became clear that Samuel Price was not simply an oddity of their valley. He was something larger, something beyond. He was a question that even the wisest could not answer, a riddle that mocked the very idea of explanation. And questions without answers do not fade, they fester. For the townsfolk, life did not return to normal. If anything, the strangeness of Samuel grew heavier with each failed attempt to explain him. And for the Price family, the burden became unbearable. Their love for their son had not wavered, but the weight of suspicion pressed harder, the isolation deeper. It was not only the strangers at their door, it was the neighbors who would no longer share a meal, the friends who crossed the road rather than greet them. It was the steady erosion of belonging, one cold glance at a time. And soon, tragedy would enter their home, not through Samuel's silence, not through his impossible feats, but through the cruel price of being his family. For the Price name itself would become a curse, and the walls of their home would bear the weight of sorrow no parent, no sibling, no child should ever endure. By the winter of 1865, the Price family was no longer simply another household in Mill Creek. They were the family of the boy, a name that once carried respect. Thomas Price, a man of steady labor and honor, had become something whispered with suspicion, laced with dread. To belong to Samuel was to belong to a curse, and slowly, piece by piece, that curse began to hollow them out. It started with isolation. Rebecca, who had once been welcomed at quilting circles and kitchen gatherings, now found doors closed when she knocked. Women she had shared bread and laughter with crossed the street when she passed. Even those who pitied her kept their distance, as though pity might invite misfortune. Alone in her home, she wrote letters she never sent, pages filled with the ache of loneliness and the fear that her son was costing them everything. "I love him," she wrote in one fragile entry, "but love has turned me into a stranger in my own town." Thomas bore the weight differently. He was a man used to being respected, to being greeted with a nod at the tavern, to shaking hands with neighbors who trusted his word. But now his very presence soured conversations. His offers of help were politely declined, his voice no longer welcomed in the Council of Farmers. Pride hardened in him like a shield, but behind it grew anger, a deep, silent rage at a town that had branded his family as outcasts. That rage boiled over at times, in arguments with Rebecca, in harsh words shouted into the empty air when he thought no one listened. He loved his son, yes, but he could not escape the gnawing thought that Samuel had stolen the life he once knew. The children of Mill Creek felt the fear of their parents and carried it forward with cruelty. They mocked Samuel in the schoolyard, not with words. His silence left little to mock, but with stones, with laughter, with games that cast him as the monster to be chased. Yet whenever they tried to corner him, strange things happened. The wind would whip dust into their eyes, or their feet would slip on dry ground, or a sudden noise would scatter them in fright. They returned home bruised, not from Samuel's hand but from the world around him, as if even nature itself defended him. To their parents this was only further proof that he was no ordinary boy, but it was not only the living who carried the weight of Samuel's existence. Death too began to shadow the Prices. The first to fall was Thomas's younger brother, Henry, who lived nearby and often came to help with the farm. A strong, lively man, Henry was well liked, one of the few who still visited Des. Pite the Whispers. In late autumn, he was struck suddenly with fever. No remedy could cool his burning skin. He raved in delirium, calling Samuel's name again and again, until one night he fell silent forever. At the funeral, neighbors avoided the boy's gaze, muttering that the sickness had been no sickness at all, that it was the curse of his presence. Weeks later, Rebecca's mother passed in her sleep, though she had been in good health. And when another relative, a cousin visiting from the next county, fell from his horse and broke his neck, the whispers turned to certainty. The Price family is cursed, people said. The boy brings ruin wherever he goes. Tragedy pressed harder still within the farmhouse walls. Rebecca herself grew ill, not with fever, but with something slower, a wasting weakness that left her pale and tired. Some nights she woke screaming, convinced she had seen figures standing at the edge of her bed, shadows that vanished when she blinked. Samuel would sit by her side, silent as always, his strange eyes watching, as if he understood her suffering in ways no one else could. She clung to him, even as Thomas began to retreat further into himself. For Thomas, grief became suspicion. He never spoke the thought aloud, but in the deepest hours of the night, he wondered if the boy was truly his. How could his flesh and blood carry such strangeness, such sorrow? He would watch Samuel from across the room, searching his face for signs of something, anything that might betray a truth too terrible to name. And in Samuel's calm, unreadable gaze, he found no comfort, only mystery. Neighbors whispered that the farmhouse itself had become cursed ground. Travelers avoided the road that passed nearby, choosing longer routes rather than risk a glimpse of Samuel at the window. Children swore the house groaned louder than others in the wind, that lights flickered in its halls long after the lamps were snuffed. It became less a home and more a haunted landmark, a place spoken of but not visited. The Prices tried in their way to hold together. Rebecca clung to her son's quiet company, Thomas to the hard labor of his fields. But grief and suspicion corroded even love. Arguments grew sharper, meals passed in silence heavier than Samuel's own, and always behind it all was the boy, watching, listening, absorbing everything with the stillness of something far older than his years. The irony was bitter. The Prices had loved their son fiercely, yet it was that very love that made them vulnerable to the scorn of others. To protect him, they closed themselves off. To defend him, they sacrificed their standing, and in the end, their devotion only deepened the curse that bore their name. The town, once merely fearful, now began to despise. They saw the Price home as a blot on their valley, a festering reminder that their lives were not as safe, not as orderly as they wanted to believe. Some spoke of driving the family out. Others suggested harsher measures, whispering that only fire could cleanse a curse. The preacher warned that God's patience would not last forever, that to tolerate the boy was to invite judgment upon them all. Yet through it all, Samuel remained unchanged. He neither raged nor wept. He did not shrink under scorn nor strike back at cruelty. He moved through his days with quiet calm, a shadow within the storm, as if none of it touched him. And perhaps that was what unsettled people most, that no matter what tragedy befell his family, no matter what hatred surrounded him, Samuel seemed to endure. But endurance has its cost, and one night Mill Creek would learn just how heavy that cost could become. Because there would come an evening when Samuel Price no longer remained a quiet burden, no longer a shadow in the corner of their fears. There would come a night when he stood at the center of it all, and the entire town would bear witness to something so unexplainable, so terrifying that their fear would harden into legend. The night that shook the town was coming, and once it arrived, nothing in Mill Creek, nor in the memory of those who lived there, would ever be the same. It was a February evening in 1866 when Mill Creek's world split in two, before the night and after it. Snow still clung to the ground, the river ran dark and swollen from the thaw, and a restless wind coiled through the valley like an omen. The townsfolk would later say they had felt it before it happened, a heaviness in the air, the uncanny stillness of animals, the way the moon seemed unnaturally bright, bathing the crooked streets in a pale, almost metallic glow. The night began like any other, farmers returning from the tavern, mothers drawing curtains, children tucked beneath quilts. But then came the sound. A howl. Not of wolf, not of wind, but something deeper, stranger, reverberating as if the ground itself was groaning. It rose through the valley in waves, carrying dread into every household. Doors slammed shut, lamps were lit. Yet curiosity gnawed at fear, and soon shadows moved toward the source, the Price farmhouse. The house, already a place of rumor, now glowed with an unnatural light. Witnesses swore it pulsed like a lantern hidden under water, swelling and dimming in rhythm, breathing as though alive. The glow bled through the cracks in the shutters, seeping into the snow until the ground itself shimmered faintly. And in the midst of it stood Samuel. He was outside, barefoot in the snow, wearing nothing but his thin nightshirt. His skin did not redden from the cold. His breath did not plume in the icy air. He stood still, his face lifted to the swollen moon, his eyes reflecting its silver light until they seemed to blaze. Rebecca rushed out first, calling his name, but her voice faltered, strangled by terror. She had seen him wander before, seen his strange trances, but never like this. Thomas followed, shouting, grabbing at his son's shoulder, but Samuel did not flinch, did not blink. He only raised a hand, small and pale, toward the heavens. Then the wind changed. It came sudden and violent, a scream of air that bent trees, rattled windows, and drove the watching crowd to their knees. From the river came a roar, not water but something beneath it, a groaning shift that cracked the ice and sent waves crashing against the banks. The townsfolk clutched each other, staring wide-eyed at the boy who seemed to command it all. Some swore they saw figures in the gale, shadows that moved against the wind, twisting, writhing, reaching towards Samuel like supplicants. Others claimed the snow rose not as flurries but as shapes, faces, distorted and fleeting, whispering in languages no living soul could know. And then came the fire. Not fire as men know it. No orange tongues or smoke, but white, blinding flames that spilled from the earth around Samuel's feet. The snow did not melt. The wood of the fence did not catch. Instead, the fire burned cold, a light so pure it hurt the eyes, casting stark shadows that danced wildly across the farmhouse walls. The crowd fell to the ground, some weeping, some praying, some screaming that the end had come. Through it all, Samuel stood unmoved, his gaze fixed on the sky, his thin arm raised. He seemed less child than vessel, a bridge between worlds. His silence was no longer the silence of a boy. It was the silence of something vast, unfathomable, bearing down upon the valley. Rebecca collapsed, sobbing his name. Thomas staggered forward, shouting for the crowd to leave them be, his voice breaking with both fury and fear. But even he faltered when Samuel finally moved. The boy lowered his hand. The wind ceased instantly, The glow receded. The fire sank into the ground as if swallowed. And silence, true, heavy silence, blanketed Mill Creek. For one breathless moment, nothing stirred. Then Samuel turned, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. Every soul theirs, he felt it. A gaze that pierced bone and memory, a weight that stripped away pretense. They saw themselves reflected, sins, fears, desires, laid bare in a child's unblinking stare. Some cried out, unable to endure it. Others swore their hearts stopped in their chests. And when Samuel finally lowered his eyes, the crowd exhaled as though released from an invisible grip. But the damage was done. From that night on, no one doubted. Samuel was not merely strange. He was other, a child, yes, but one who bore something that defied scripture, nature, and sanity. To some, he was a demon in disguise. To others, a messenger, a harbinger of judgment. To all, he was proof that the world was not what they believed it to be. In the days that followed, Mill Creek tore itself apart. Families argued over what they had seen. The preacher thundered that the devil himself walked among them. Others whispered that perhaps Samuel was chosen, a prophet or an angel sent to test their faith. But whether curse or blessing, one truth bound them together: they could not escape him. The boy lived among them still. For the Prices, the night was both a revelation and a breaking point. Rebecca clung to Samuel with renewed fervor, convinced now more than ever that he was touched by something divine, chosen for a purpose beyond their comprehension. Thomas, however, looked at his son with a fear he could no longer disguise. Pride and denial had crumbled. He had seen with his own eyes what the boy could summon, and it shook the core of everything he believed about family, blood, and God. And Samuel, he remained as he always had been, silent, watchful, untouchable. But those who dared look closely swore something had changed in him. His stillness seemed heavier now, his gaze sharper, as if the veil between child and enigma had thinned. He was no longer merely a boy whom science could not explain. He was something more. Something the town could never forget. That night became legend, retold in whispers, embroidered with fear. Some said the wind carried voices of the dead. Others insisted the cold fire left scars on the ground that never faded. Children grew up hearing the tale, shivering at the thought that one boy had stood at the center of it all, and those who were there, the men and women who had seen it with their own eyes, they carried it in their bones until their dying breath. For Mill Creek, the night was not just an event, it was a wound, and wounds, once opened, do not heal. The morning after the night of fire and wind, Mill Creek woke in silence. The snow was still thick, the river still swollen, but the valley itself seemed altered, hushed as though holding its breath. People emerged from their homes in wary groups, scanning the sky, the trees, the very ground beneath their feet, half expecting the strange glow to return. Nothing stirred. And yet everyone knew the world was no longer the same. Whispers spread faster than the thawing river. At the general store, men argued in hoarse voices, swearing what they had seen, some insisting Samuel had conjured fire, others that the wind had spoken in human tongues, others still that the boy had stared straight into their souls. At the church, women clutched their rosaries, muttering that the devil had planted himself in the body of a child. By dusk, there was not a single house in Mill Creek untouched by the story. But with the story came fear. Children were warned not to go near the Price farm. Farmers crossing the valley made the sign of the cross when passing the old house. Mothers pulled their children closer whenever Samuel's name was mentioned, as though the very sound might summon him. For Rebecca, the aftermath was a test of faith. She walked through town with her chin high, daring anyone to look her in the eye. "The Lord works in mysteries," she told them, her voice unshaken, "and who are we to question his vessel?" Yet when she returned home, when Samuel sat starry, Sang into the distance with those eyes that seemed older than the mountains. Even she trembled. She prayed harder than she ever had before, not for deliverance, but for understanding. Thomas, however, began to unravel. He avoided the tavern, where men now whispered his name with pity or suspicion. He stopped attending church, unable to stomach the preacher's sermons about devils and curses, and he avoided his own son, lingering at the fields until after dark, slipping into bed long after Samuel was asleep. The man who once demanded order in his household now found himself powerless, his authority shattered by the boy who should have been his pride. The townsfolk, meanwhile, split into camps. One faction, led by the preacher, insisted Samuel was a blight, a curse upon Mill Creek. They demanded that the Prices leave the valley, that the boy be taken elsewhere, even destroyed. Another, smaller faction clung to the possibility that Samuel was a chosen vessel, a prophet sent to warn or prepare them for something greater. But belief did not bring comfort, it only deepened the mystery. And in the middle stood the Prices, trapped between fear and worship, between exile and reverence. The night of fire had left its marks. Some claimed the earth where Samuel stood was scorched white, though snow covered it. Others said the air there was different, charged, humming faintly like the low drone of unseen bees. A handful of children, daring each other, crept near the spot days later and returned pale, insisting their ears rang for hours afterward. The place became a forbidden ground, avoided by most, feared by all. What no one could deny was the change in the boy himself. Though Samuel had always been distant, after that night his silence carried a new weight. He sat for hours, unmoving, staring at the horizon as though waiting. His eyes seemed sharper, and when he fixed them on someone, they felt exposed, hollowed, as though he could see through skin to whatever secrets lay beneath. Even the bravest men faltered under that gaze, looking away quickly, ashamed of their own fear of a child. And yet Samuel never threatened, never spoke, never raised a hand. He did nothing but exist. And that was enough. By spring, Mill Creek had fractured. Some families left, packing their wagons under cover of night, unwilling to raise children in a place touched by such a presence. Others dug in deeper, clinging to their farms with grim determination, muttering that abandoning land was a worse curse than any child. But none could shake the memory. The town was now a place of haunted eyes, whispered prayers, and a fear that settled into the bones. Rebecca grew thinner, her cheeks hollow, her hands trembling from sleepless nights. Thomas aged a decade in months, his shoulders bent, his hair streaked with grey. And Samuel remained untouched by time, as if what coursed through him insulated him from the wear and tear of life. He did not grow as other children did. He did not weaken or pale. He remained the same, an unchanging figure in a world of decay. What made the aftermath unbearable was not knowing if Samuel was a curse or a gift, a danger or a savior, not knowing if the night had been a singular event or the beginning of something greater. The uncertainty gnawed at them, twisting faith into doubt, turning neighbors into enemies. Mill Creek was no longer a town, it was a wound dressed in silence. And at the heart of that silence sat the boy science could not explain, waiting, watching, as though time itself moved differently for him. The Price family bore the weight of Samuel's presence for years, and yet nothing could prepare them or Mill Creek for what came next. One morning, late in 1867, Samuel simply was not there. The farmhouse doors were locked, the windows unbroken, the hearth cold. Rebecca's first instinct was panic. Thomas's, disbelief. They called. They searched. They scoured the surrounding woods. But the boy, who had never once spoken a word, did not answer, did not stir, did not appear. The neighbors, already wary, whispered furiously. Some swore they had seen him wandering into the woods the night before, his figure fading into shadow like smoke caught in moonlight. Others claimed he had been taken, swept away by spirits, angels or demons, depending on who told the story. Every theory was colored by the fear that had accumulated over years, the inexplicable events, the nights of terror, the unyielding calm of the boy who had defied every law of man and nature. Search parties formed, though not everyone dared enter the dense, snow-laden forest. Horses stamped nervously at the edges of trees, and the wind seemed to whisper warnings no one could comprehend. They found no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing that hinted at how Samuel had vanished. Even the ground beneath the spot where he had last stood, the place still scorched faintly from the night of fire, appeared untouched, as though nothing had ever walked there. Some townsfolk theorized that Samuel had chosen to leave. He had grown into something beyond their world, and the silence they had feared was merely a prelude to his departure. Others feared he had been taken by forces beyond comprehension, angels or demons claiming a life that was never meant to belong fully to this earth. For Mill Creek, it was impossible to discern blessing from curse. They only knew the void Samuel left behind was tangible, heavy, and suffocating. The Price family was devastated. Rebecca, desperate to maintain a grip on reality, scoured the forest daily, speaking to him aloud despite knowing he would never answer. Thomas alternated between despair and anger, accusing the town silently for pushing their son into a place where he could vanish. The house, once a haven, beckoned, became oppressive, hollowed by the absence of the boy who had defined it. Every object, every creaking floorboard, every shadowed corner spoke of the child who had been there, and was no longer. In the days and weeks that followed, fragments of testimony emerged, each more puzzling than the last. A shepherd reported seeing a small figure moving effortlessly along the ridges of distant hills, seemingly untouched by snow or wind. A traveling merchant swore he glimpsed Samuel on a distant road, walking alone under the stars, barefoot, with his head tilted toward the sky. And yet, no one could confirm these sightings, and many dismissed them as hysteria fueled by legend. Mill Creek itself struggled to return to life. People avoided the Price farm, now a monument to absence, to fear, and to unanswered questions. Some blamed themselves, believing their fear or whispers had driven the boy away. Others, more practical, feared whatever had taken him might return. And for years, each winter when snow blanketed the valley, whispers of his silhouette on the hills or by the river resurfaced, as if the boy's memory had been stitched into the land itself. The disappearance marked the turning point of Samuel's legend. He was no longer just the strange boy who could defy nature. He became a ghost, a question, a symbol of everything Mill Creek could not explain. And yet, the mystery endured beyond the town's borders. Letters and journals began to circulate in neighboring counties, recounting the boy whose presence had been a force, whose absence became a riddle. Historians and curious minds, both scientific and occult, would later arrive, piecing together the scraps of testimony left behind. They pored over journals, interviewed elderly townsfolk, measured the terrain around the Price property, yet every inquiry ended in frustration. Samuel Price could not be pinned down. Even the night of fire and wind, the pinnacle of his phenomenon, was recounted with variations, contradictions, and embellishments that made the truth slippery. Some claimed he had ascended, swept away to a place where the laws of this world no longer applied. Others insisted he had wandered into the forests, never aging, a spectral observer of generations to come, and a few whispered darker possibilities that he had simply slipped between realms, no longer bound to human form, his consciousness touching lives unseen, shaping events from the shadows. For the Price family, none of these explanations offered solace. Rebecca aged in quiet despair, writing letters that went unsent, recording her son's life in fragments she feared would be lost to time. Thomas left Mill Creek entirely a few years later, unable to bear the town's lingering suspicion and the memories embedded in every corner of their home. And the house, abandoned by the family, stood as a testament to the boy who had defied everything and vanished without a trace. Even decades later, visitors to Mill Creek reported strange occurrences. Animals avoided the Price property, shadows seemed to linger unnaturally, and on rare nights townsfolk swore they saw a small figure at the edge of the forest silhouetted against the moon, watching. Every sighting carried the same impossible air of familiarity and dread. Samuel Price had become more than a boy. He had become a legend, an enduring question that refused closure. And the stories persisted, whispered in hushed tones, written in journals, passed down through generations. Each account varied, but the essence remained. A boy who should not have existed, who defied the laws of nature, who vanished without warning, leaving behind nothing but awe, terror, and unanswered questions. Mill Creek would never forget him. The valley seemed forever marked by his presence, his absence, and the impossible events that had made his life and disappearance legendary. For Samuel Price, no timeline could contain him, no understanding could define him, and no fear could diminish the strange power of his story. The boy had vanished, but the enigma he carried endured, reaching beyond memory, history, and reason itself. And in that endurance lay the unsettling truth. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only witnessed, carried, and remembered. Samuel Price, though vanished, refused to be forgotten. His story seeped into the collective memory of Mill Creek and beyond, a tale that grew with each retelling. Diaries, letters, and journal entries became the threads of a tapestry that historians and folklorists would attempt to unravel for generations. Each account carried fragments of truth, shadows of memory, and the undeniable sense that the boy had been more than human. Local records preserved the first whispers. Clergy notes described a child touched by the divine or the damned, a phrase that haunted margins for decades. Farmers recounted the strange occurrences around the farmhouse, objects moving of their own accord, fires that burned without heat, the unnatural stillness of Samuel's presence. Each testimony passed down gained a layer of legend. Children told the story around hearths, embellishing with each telling. The boy who walked barefoot through snow without cold, the eyes that saw everything, the wind and fire that bent to his will. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, amateur historians and paranormal enthusiasts began to collect these accounts. Journals once dismissed as the ramblings of a fearful town gained attention. Dr. Elias Granger's meticulous notes were rediscovered in a dusty archive, analyzed for insight. He had recorded measurements, observations, and baffling phenomena, each note a window into a life that defied explanation. Scientists attempted to rationalize them, suggesting exaggeration, mass hysteria, or natural anomalies, but the consistency across independent reports frustrated every rational explanation. Even folklore preserved the story. Songs were sung, plays written, and whispers told to children as both caution and fascination. In every version, Samuel retained his aura of enigma. He was sometimes depicted as a prodigy of impossible knowledge, sometimes as a cursed child, sometimes as a spirit wandering the earth. The line between reality and myth blurred, but the essential truth remained. Mill Creek had known a boy who could not be explained. Occasionally the tale drew the attention of more prominent figures in science and the occult. Researchers in psychology and parapsychology sought out the valley, examining the landscape, interviewing descendants of those who had lived through the events. Some claimed residual energy lingered near the old Price farmhouse. A few townsfolk recounted strange occurrences decades later, objects moving inexplicably, animals reacting with fear, glimpses of a small figure at twilight. Each observation rekindled curiosity and reinforced the notion that Samuel Price had left an imprint on the world that persisted long after his departure. Scholars debated endlessly. Was Samuel a mutation, a child born with abilities that science could not yet explain, or was he something more, a manifestation of forces humanity could barely perceive? Some suggested he had been a savant, whose abilities exceeded comprehension, while others leaned towards supernatural explanations. Paranormal investigators cited his memory, resilience, and influence over the elements as evidence of a presence beyond the human realm. The more rigorous the analysis, the more elusive the answers became. Every theory raised questions it could not resolve. Yet the historical record did not exist solely in formal documents. Oral histories passed from parent to child kept the story alive. Every town nearby carried whispers of the Price boy, a name that became shorthand for the inexplicable. Folk tales stretched the boundaries of what was witnessed, yet the core remained. Samuel had been there, and he had hanged the world around him, if only for a moment, if only in Mill Creek. Even skeptics acknowledged a common thread. There was something undeniable in the consistency of Descriptions: the calm yet piercing gaze, the unnatural control over objects, the events that defied natural laws. Dismissed as hysteria or exaggeration by some, these elements were nonetheless recorded across decades, proving that Samuel's life and the mystery surrounding it could not be easily explained or ignored. For historians, Samuel became a symbol of humanity's limits. He represented the intersection of faith, fear, and curiosity. To study him was to confront the boundaries of understanding, to witness how a single human life could ripple through time, leaving traces that neither reason nor myth could fully contain. Each new generation, reading old journals or hearing retellings, was drawn into the enigma, feeling the same awe and unease that had gripped Mill Creek in 1866. Yet the most haunting echoes were not found in written records. They were found in the landscape, the houses, and the memories of those who dared to speak. Travelers claimed to feel a strange presence near the Price property. Some reported hearing whispers in the wind, glimpsing shadows at dusk, or sensing eyes upon them when no one was there. Samuel Price, though gone, had become a ghost in the cultural and psychological sense, a reminder that some forces, some mysteries, resist containment and explanation. The story of Samuel Price endures, not as proof of the supernatural, nor merely as historical anomaly, but as an invitation to question, to wonder, to confront the limits of what is known. For historians, psychologists, and ordinary observers alike, Samuel remains a puzzle that cannot be solved, a shadow that cannot be caught, and perhaps that is precisely the point. Some mysteries are meant to linger, shaping the world quietly, inexorably, long after the people who witnessed them have gone. Even today in the 21st century, the tale survives. Books, articles, and online discussions revive his story, exploring it from every angle. Paranormal podcasts debate the plausibility of his powers. Local tours of Mill Creek still point toward the Price farmhouse, though it stands in ruin, silent as ever, a monument to absence. And in every retelling, the questions remain: who was Samuel Price? What was he capable of? And why, after all these years, does the world still feel his presence? In the end, Samuel Price's story does not resolve. It does not offer comfort, closure, or certainty. It exists as an echo, haunting each generation that seeks to understand it. He is remembered not only because of what he did, but because of what he represented: the unknowable, the inexplicable, the uncontainable. Samuel Price was, and perhaps always will be, a boy without a place in time, a living question that refuses an answer. Time moves differently around legends. For some, it stretches endlessly. For others, it snaps back like a taut string. But for Samuel Price, it seems time itself could not claim him. Mill Creek changed, decades passed, yet the memory of the boy remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. His story, woven into the land, the forests, the river, refused to fade. Every whisper, every retelling carried the weight of the impossible, the fear and the awe that had gripped those who had glimpsed him firsthand. And therein lies the paradox. Samuel Price was both everywhere and nowhere. He had vanished from the valley, yet he lingered in minds, journals, and collective memory. Children who never saw him spoke his name. Travelers who arrived long after his disappearance sensed him in the shadows of the old Price property. Historians and paranormal investigators catalogued accounts, piecing together fragments that never formed a complete picture yet somehow felt whole in their mystery. In every retelling, the question remained: was he human, divine, or something else entirely? Perhaps he was all three, or perhaps none. Attempts to categorize Samuel only revealed the limits of understanding. Science could not define him, faith could not contain him, folklore could only hint at his presence, and in that refusal to be defined he became eternal, a figure who defied the normal boundaries of time and existence. His eyes, the witnesses said, were not merely eyes, they were mirrors reflecting truths humans were not prepared to face, glimpses into a world both familiar and alien. Yet there is something profoundly human in the legacy of a boy who leaves no answers. Samuel Price reminds us of the fragility of certainty, the peril of believing we can know all that exists. He was a mirror to the fears, desires, and wonder of those around him, showing that even a single life can ripple outward, bending the rules of perception, challenging the boundaries of reality. To this day, one can walk the old paths near the Price farmhouse, feel a chill that is not from the wind, see a shadow that moves with impossible timing, and sense the weight of a presence that does not belong entirely to this world. For those who study his story, Samuel becomes more than a curiosity. He is a lesson that some phenomena are not meant to be dissected, measured, or explained, that mystery is not a problem to solve, but a force to reckon with, that the universe in all its vastness can contain truths beyond comprehension, and sometimes it chooses a single human life to reveal them, fleetingly, impossibly. And so the tale lingers. In the journals, in whispered stories, in the rustling trees of Mill Creek, Samuel Price persists, not as a boy who existed in a single moment, but as a question stretched across time, refusing resolution. Historians, psychologists, and folklorists may argue, speculate, and theorize, but the core truth is untouchable. Samuel Price's existence defies certainty, and it always will. As the sun sets over the valley, painting the hills in gold and shadow, he can imagine Samuel walking through the forests, silent, invisible to the eyes of men, yet ever present. Perhaps he watches, perhaps he waits, or perhaps he has moved on to realms no living person can follow. What is certain is that his story does not end in disappearance. It ends in wonder, dread, and the recognition that some mysteries are eternal. And in that eternal mystery lies the fascination, the unease, and the haunting beauty of Samuel Price. A boy without a place in time, yet occupying the imaginations of generations. A force that resists explanation, a memory that refuses to fade, and a presence that challenges the human desire for closure. For those who are drawn to the hidden, the unexplainable, and the dark corners of history, Samuel's story remains a reminder. Some truths cannot, and perhaps should not, be unveiled. Some mysteries exist to make us pause, to make us question, to make us feel the edge of a world we cannot fully understand. And in those moments of awe and fear, the legend lives on. So remember his name, Samuel Price. Remember the boy who walked between worlds, who vanished into the unknown, and who left behind a story that defies the passage of time. Because some stories are more than history. They are echoes, lasting far beyond the span of a single life, and in their resonance they shape the way we see the world forever. If you are captivated by tales of the impossible, drawn to the mysteries that science and faith cannot explain, subscribe to uncover more hidden stories that linger in the shadows of history, stories that challenge reality, defy understanding, and leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the world.